TV, where the night never sleeps, and neither should you. Tonight, we're diving deep into the darkness with some spine-chilling stormy night tales that'll make you think twice about what lurks in the shadows. From whispers in the wind to shadowy figures at the window, and even a storm that brings something far more terrifying than rain. Prepare yourself for the stories you'll never forget. Buckle up, because when the thunder rolls, the nightmares begin.
The Stormbringer. Old man Whitaker sat in his favorite armchair by the window, his cane resting across his lap. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp as he watched the storm roll in. "Big one tonight," he muttered to himself, his voice gravelly. "'Tis time again." Outside, the townsfolk had begun to gather. They knew the legend, of course. Whitaker had told it enough times over the years, every time a storm this fierce came through. Old Mrs. Hanson, her face pinched with worry, leaned over to her husband. Do you think he's right? About the Stormbringer?" Her husband, a stout man with a skeptical look on his face, shook his head. "It's just an old man's tale. Superstition. Nothing more." Still, as the thunder rumbled and the wind whipped through the streets, the people couldn't help but glance nervously at the sky. Inside, Whitaker chuckled to himself. He could hear them whispering outside his window. Doubting. They always doubted. But he knew better. He'd seen the Stormbringer. He'd seen him the last time he came, 80 years ago, and he was just a boy. The storm had been so fierce that night. Sky black as pitch, lightning cracking like the earth itself was tearing apart. When the storm had reached its peak, he'd seen the figure, cloaked in shadow, riding the winds, eyes glowing like embers. Stormbringer, the one who came to collect. And tonight, Whitaker was sure, the Stormbringer would return. Suddenly, the first flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm had arrived. Townspeople outside flinched, their eyes darting to the darkening clouds. The wind howled even louder, rattling the windows of the old houses. Whitaker gripped his cane tightly, his heart racing. He knew what was coming next. The Stormbringer always came when the storm was at its fiercest. He would ride the wind, his cloak trailing behind him like shadows, and he would claim a soul. But who would it be? The townsfolk huddled together, exchanging nervous glances. Old Mrs. Hanson crossed herself, muttering a prayer under her breath. "It's just a storm," husband insisted, though his voice wavered. Another flash of lightning, this one closer. The air seemed to crackle with electricity. The wind screamed, and the trees bent under its fury. And then, through the roar of the storm, they heard it. A low, mournful howl. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was him, the Stormbringer. The howl grew louder, rising above the sound of the wind and the rain. People outside looked up, their faces pale with fear. "He's here," someone whispered, and the group shifted uneasily. Old man Whitaker leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on the window. Could feel it. Pull, the presence of something ancient and terrible in the storm. And then he saw it. A shadow moving through the swirling clouds just at the edge of his vision. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch out toward the ground. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Whitaker's heart pounded in his chest. "He's come for me," he whispered, voice shaking. "It's my time." Outside, the townsfolk began to panic. They could see the shadow now, moving closer, gliding through the storm like it was part of the wind itself. "Get inside," someone shouted. "Get inside now." Crowds scattered, running for their homes, slamming doors, locking windows. Streets emptied in moments, leaving only the sound of the storm and the shadow that drifted ever closer. Whitaker struggled to his feet, cane slipping from his grasp. Hands shook, but he wasn't afraid. He had been waiting for this moment for years. The Stormbringer had finally come. As the shadow passed through the town, the lights flickered and the wind grew colder. It swept through the streets like a phantom, unseen by most but felt by all. Every hair stood on end, and the air was thick with something unnatural. Whitaker stood by the window, his frail body trembling, but his eyes bright with understanding. The Stormbringer was close now, right outside his door. "I'm ready," he whispered. "I'm ready." He waited, his breath shallow, tart thudding in his chest. Nothing happened. The storm raged on, and the wind howled, but the shadow moved past his house, gliding toward the center of town. Whitaker's eyes widened in disbelief. No, it's supposed to be me. He stumbled toward the door, flinging it open, the wind nearly knocking him off his feet. Stormbringer, called into the night, voice hoarse. You're supposed to take me. But the shadow didn't stop. It drifted farther away into the storm, toward another house, toward a different soul. The townspeople watched from behind their curtains, their hearts pounding. Who would it be? Who was the Stormbringer coming for? Lightning flashed, and for a brief moment the figure was illuminated in the sky. Tall, dark shape with glowing eyes, its long arms reaching down toward the earth. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The storm continued to rage, but the shadow had vanished. People held their breath, waiting for something, anything. But the only sound was the wind and the rain. Slowly, cautiously, the townsfolk began to emerge from their homes, peering out into the storm. Is it over? Mrs. Hanson whispered, clutching her husband's arm. He didn't answer. He wasn't sure. Old man Whitaker stood in the doorway of his house, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had been so sure that the Stormbringer had come for him. But he was still here, and that could only mean one thing. Someone else had been taken. The townsfolk gathered in the town square, whispering among themselves, glancing nervously at the sky. Who is it? Someone asked. Who did he take? No one knew. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a young woman stepped forward, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. It's my brother, she said, her voice trembling. He's gone. The crowd fell silent. The Stormbringer had taken him. And as the storm slowly began to die down, the people realized that the legend was true. The Stormbringer had come for a soul, but it wasn't the one they had expected.
The Rain Walker. The rain had been relentless for hours, turning the roads into rivers. Tom gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he squinted through the windshield. The storm was bad, really bad. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him, and every so often a flash of lightning would reveal the desolate highway stretching out into the night. Just a little farther, he muttered to himself, trying to keep calm. He wasn't far from home now. Just another 30 minutes, maybe less if the storm let up. But the way things were going, it seemed like the rain was only getting worse. The wind howled, pushing against his car like invisible hands, making the vehicle slightly on the slick road. Tom turned up the radio, trying to drown out the storm, but all he got was static. Of course, out in the middle of nowhere, with a storm like this, what did he expect? His phone was dead too, naturally. Just his luck. As he continued down the road, lightning flashed again, lighting up the landscape for a brief moment. That's when he saw it. A lone figure, walking along the side of the road. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen another car for miles. Who in their right mind would be walking out here in the middle of a storm like this? The figure was drenched, head bowed against the wind and rain, their clothes plastered to their body. They didn't seem to notice Tom's car approaching, just kept walking steadily along the shoulder of the road. For a split second, Tom thought about just driving past. It wasn't safe to stop in a storm like that. But guilt gnawed at him. What if the person was hurt? Lost? Stranded? Couldn't just leave them out here. But he? With a sigh, Tom slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. The rain drummed loudly on the roof as he rolled down the passenger window just a crack, shouting over the sound of the storm. Hey, you need a ride? Figure stopped walking and slowly turned toward the car. For a moment, they didn't move, just stood there in the rain, staring at Tom through the downpour. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the way they were standing, so still, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But he shook it off. It was probably just the storm playing tricks on him. Come on, get in, Tom called, trying to sound more confident than he felt. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved, walking slowly toward the car. Tom unlocked the door, and the figure climbed in without a word, water dripping from their clothes onto the seat. Tom glanced at his new passenger. It was hard to make out their features in the dim light, but they appeared to be a man, tall and thin, with long, wet hair hanging over their face. Their clothes were soaked through, and they didn't seem to have any belongings with them. No bag, no jacket, nothing. Rough night, huh? Tom said, trying to break the awkward silence as he pulled back onto the road. The man didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, water still dripping from his hair onto the seat. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Okay, maybe the guy was just shaken up. After all, walking through a storm like this couldn't be easy. "Where are you headed?" Tom asked after a long pause. Again, no response. Tom glanced at the man out of the corner of his eye. The guy was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting in his lap, his head tilted slightly forward as if deep in thought. But something about him felt off. The silence in the car grew heavier with each passing minute. The rain pounded on the roof, and the wind howled outside. But inside the car, it was eerily quiet. "Look, buddy, if you don't want to talk, that's fine," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "But if there's somewhere you need to go, just let me know." The man turned his head slowly, finally looking at Tom's stomach twisted. The man's eyes were dark, too dark, almost like they were made of shadow, with no light reflecting in them. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. "I'm going home," the man said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Tom swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "Home? Where's that?" The man didn't answer. He just turned his head back toward the road, his face expressionless. Tom's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. The air inside the car felt heavy, like it was pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. As they drove on, the storm seemed to grow worse. The rain fell harder, the wind howled louder, and the lightning flashed more frequently. It felt like the world outside the car was unraveling. Tom tried to keep his focus on the road, but his eyes kept drifting toward the man sitting beside him. Couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Suddenly, the man spoke again, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You should have kept driving." Tom blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "What?" "You shouldn't have stopped," the man said, his voice low and haunting. "You shouldn't have picked me up." Tom's blood ran cold. He glanced at the man, who was now staring directly at him, those dark, empty eyes boring into his soul. Who are you?" Tom stammered, his hands shaking on the wheel. The man smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a shiver down Tom's spine. "I'm the one who walks with the storm." Tom's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean? What are you?" The man leaned closer, his voice a whisper in Tom's ear. "The storm follows me. It always has, and it always will." Tom's breath caught in his throat. He glanced out the window. Lightning flashed, illuminating the road for a split second. Something was different. The road was gone. The landscape outside had changed, replaced by a swirling vortex of wind and rain, like the eye of a hurricane. The storm wasn't just outside the car, it was all around them. It was everywhere. Panicked, Tom slammed on the brakes, but the car kept moving, gliding through the storm as if the road had disappeared beneath them. "What's happening?" Tom shouted, voice trembling. The man's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "You invited the storm in when you let me in." Tom's heart raced as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what was happening. The wind screamed outside, the rain pelted the car, but inside the air was deathly still. "You can't outrun the storm," the man whispered. "Can't escape it." Tom's mind raced. He had to do something, anything, to get away from this nightmare. Lowered the gas pedal. The car didn't move any faster. It was as if the storm had them trapped in its grip. The man leaned back in his seat, his smile fading. "I don't need to take you, you know. The storm, it chooses who it wants." Tom's chest tightened as the storm raged on around them. The lightning flashed again, and for a brief moment, Tom thought he saw something in the distance. A figure standing in the rain, waiting. "What do you want from me?" Tom demanded, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. He simply looked out the window, his face expressionless once more. The storm began to calm. The rain softened, the wind died down, and the lightning faded into the distance. The car slowed to a stop, the road reappearing beneath them, as if nothing had happened. Tom stared out the windshield, his heart pounding in his chest. The storm was gone. Everything was back to normal. But when he turned to the passenger seat, the man was gone too. The seat was empty, completely dry, as if no one had ever been there. Tom's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by the storm. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A single wet footprint on the floor of the passenger side, the shadow in the rain. It was one of those nights where the rain seemed to have no end. The kind of rain that made the world outside disappear behind a thick, gray curtain. Inside, the house felt cozy, but to 14-year-old Ethan, felt a little too quiet. Too dark. His parents were out for the night, dinner with friends in the city, they said, leaving Ethan home alone. It wasn't the first time he'd been on his own during a storm, but something about tonight felt different. There was an odd heaviness in the air, kind that made his skin prickle. Ethan sat on the couch, pretending to focus on his video game. The sound of the storm outside kept pulling his attention away. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the windows in their frame. Lightning flashed again, and for a split second, the entire room lit up like it was midday. Then he saw it. A shadow. Standing just outside the window, barely visible in the rain. Ethan's heart jumped into his throat, his controller slipping from his hands. He blinked, hard, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. Was that a person? No. Couldn't be. No one would be out in a storm like that. He leaned forward, peering through the rain-streaked glass. The shadow was gone. Must have been my imagination, Ethan muttered to himself, though his pulse was still racing. He picked up the controller again, forcing himself to focus on the game. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The next time the lightning struck, he looked again. And there it was. A shadow. Closer this time. Ethan jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed to the window, wiping away the condensation with his sleeve. His breath fogged up the glass as he peered out into the storm. Nothing. Just rain. Pouring down in torrents, pooling in the yard. Trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches scratching against the side of the house. But there was no one there. He tried to laugh it off. Just a trick of the light, told himself. The storm's playing tricks on me. But even as he said it, didn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there. Ethan backed away from the window, his skin crawling. Maybe he was just jumpy, as he was alone. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contact. Maybe he could call his parents, or at least text his friend Jake, just someone to distract him. But before he could type out a message, the lights flickered. Ethan froze, staring at the ceiling. The lights flickered again, and then darkness. The power went out completely. "Oh, come on!" Ethan groaned, fumbling with his phone to turn on the flashlight. The room filled with the dim glow of the screen, casting long shadows across the walls. And then came the knock. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat again. It was soft, barely audible over the storm, but it was there. Faint, steady tapping, coming from the window. He swallowed hard, gripping his phone tightly as he turned toward the sound. Another flash of lightning lit up the yard, and for a split second, he saw it. The shadow. Closer now, almost at the window. Ethan's blood ran cold. He stepped back, his mind racing. What was that? Who was that? Was someone out there watching him? Tap, tap, tap. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. He had to see. He had to know. Slowly, carefully, Ethan crept toward the window, his feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. His pulse thundered in his ears as he reached the glass. He lifted his phone, the flashlight casting a small beam of light into the darkness. Nothing. There was no one there. Ethan let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. "It's just the storm," whispered, trying to convince himself. But then, as the wind howled and the rain lashed against the house, he realized something. The knock. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. Ethan's stomach dropped. He turned slowly, shining his phone's light into the room behind him. The shadows stretched across the walls, long and eerie. The furniture seemed to loom larger in the dark. And then he saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the corner of the room, just out of reach of the light. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He froze, too terrified to move. Figure didn't move either. It just stood there, watching him. The lightning flashed again, and for a split second, figure was gone. But when the darkness returned, it was back. Closer. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly dropping his phone. His heart raced, his mind screaming at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Ethan finally found his voice. Who are you?" stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Figure didn't answer. It just kept moving closer. Another flash of lightning, and suddenly, the figure was right in front of him. Ethan screamed, stumbling backward and tripping over the coffee table. He hit the ground hard, his phone skidding across the floor. The room plunged into total darkness. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his ears. Figure was gone again, or at least, didn't see it, but he could feel it. Could feel it watching him. Ethan grabbed his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the flashlight back on. He shone the light around the room, desperate to see where the figure had gone. Nothing. The room was empty, but he knew it was still there. Somewhere. Watching him. Ethan bolted for the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps as he raced to the second floor. He slammed the door to his bedroom behind him, locking it with trembling fingers. For a long moment he stood there, panting, his back pressed against the door. The rain battered the windows, the wind howling like a wild animal. The house was silent, too silent. Crept to the window, peeking through the curtains. Lightning flashed. The shadow was in the yard again, standing there, watching the house. Only this time, Ethan realized something that made his blood run cold. The figure wasn't trying to get inside. It had already been inside, and now it was just waiting for him to come out.
The night visitor. The wind howled outside, and the rain seemed to hit the window harder with every passing minute. Sarah pulled the covers up to her chin, her wide eyes watching the lightning flash across the darkened room. Her mother, sitting on the edge of the bed, smiled and gently stroked her daughter's hair. "It's just a storm, sweetie," her mother said softly. "You've been through plenty of storms before. But this one feels scarier," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the window. "It's so loud." Her mother chuckled. "That's because it's a big storm, but you're safe here. Nothing can hurt you." Sarah nodded, though she didn't feel completely convinced. The thunder cracked loudly in the distance, making her flinch. "If you get scared, just close your eyes and think of something happy," her mother said, giving her a reassuring kiss on the forehead. "Now get some sleep, okay?" "Okay," Sarah murmured. Her mother stood up and walked to the door, casting one last look back at her daughter, before flicking off the light. "Good night, sweetheart. Sweet dreams." The door clicked shut, and Sarah was left alone in the darkness. The room was still, except for the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the walls for brief moments. The shadows danced and twisted as the storm raged outside. Sarah pulled the blankets tighter around herself, her heart thumping in her chest. She tried to think of something happy. Her mom had said, Onis, ice cream, summer days at the park. But no matter how hard she tried, the storm outside kept creeping into her thoughts. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the rain pounded the roof like tiny fists. The thunder seemed closer now, louder, shaking the whole house. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to block out the sounds. Then she heard it. Creak. Her eyes shot open, her breath catching in her throat. She stared into the darkness of her room, barely able to make out the shapes of her toys and furniture. Had she imagined it? Another creak, this time louder, closer. Sarah's heart raced. She wasn't imagining it. There was definitely a sound, a slow, deliberate creaking sound, like someone was walking across the floor. Her eyes darted around the room trying to find the source. But it was so dark. Too dark. The lightning outside flashed again, but it didn't help. Everything was just shadows. Another creak. It was coming from near the window. Sarah froze. She didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The wind continued to howl outside, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. But she could hear the creaking clearly now, like footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking in her room. She quickly pulled the blanket over her head, squeezing her eyes shut. She felt safer under the covers, as though nothing could touch her there. Her breathing came fast and shallow as she tried to calm herself down. It's just the wind, she thought. The wind and the storm. Nothing else. But then the creaking stopped. Silence. For a moment, Sarah thought it was over, that maybe she had been imagining things after all. Then she heard a new sound. Breathing. Soft, raspy breathing, coming from the corner of the room. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to know what was standing there, watching her. But her curiosity got the better of her. Slowly, she peeked out from under the blanket, just enough to see. The room was pitch dark, but as the lightning flashed, her heart nearly stopped. There by the window was a figure. Tall, looming, Its outline was barely visible in the dim light, but Sarah could see it clearly enough to know that it wasn't her imagination. It wasn't a shadow. Someone was in her room. She pulled the blanket back over her head, her heart pounding harder than ever. She clamped her hands over her mouth to keep from making any noise. The breathing continued, steady and quiet. Whoever, or whatever, was standing by the window wasn't moving, but Sarah could feel its presence, could feel its eyes on her. Please go away, she thought, desperate. Please just leave. But the figure didn't leave. Just stood there, breathing softly, the sound barely audible over the storm. Sarah stayed as still as possible, too terrified to move. She could hear the rain pouring down outside, the wind rattling the windows, but all she could focus on was the figure in her room. Then, without warning, breathing stopped. Silence fell over the room once more. Sarah waited, her body trembling under the covers. Was it gone? Had it left? She didn't want to check. She didn't want to move at all, but then there was a sound, a soft shuffle. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps move across the room. Closer, closer. Sarah's breath hitched. The footsteps were coming toward her bed. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blanket even tighter. If she didn't move, if she didn't make a sound, maybe it would go away. The footsteps stopped right beside her bed. Sarah's entire body froze. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for a split second. And in that brief flash, Sarah saw the outline of the figure standing right next to her bed. Its face just inches from hers, hidden by the shadows of the blanket. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she prayed silently for it to leave, for the storm to end, for anything to make this nightmare stop. The figure didn't move. It stood there, silent and still, for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated. The figure moved away from the bed, back toward the window. Sarah could hear it, feel the air shift as it moved through the room. Finally, the creaking stopped. The room was silent once again. Sarah lay there, too terrified to move, too terrified to check if the figure was still there. She didn't sleep. She didn't even close her eyes. She just waited. Eventually, the storm began to ease. The rain softened, and the thunder grew more distant. The wind no longer howled, and the house seemed still once more. But Sarah didn't relax. Not until the first rays of morning sunlight began to filter through her window. Only then did she dare to peek out from under the blanket. The room was empty. The figure was gone. Sarah let out a shaky breath, sitting up slowly in bed. Had it all been a nightmare? Had her mind been playing tricks on her because of the storm? She glanced around the room. Everything seemed normal. Toys, her books, everything was in its place, except for one thing: muddy footprints. They started by the window and led across the room to her bed.
The Lighthouse Keeper. The storm rolled in faster than expected. The sky, once a dull gray, had turned a deep, swirling black. Lightning split the horizon, illuminating the towering cliffs for a moment, or plunging everything back into shadow. Inside the cabin, Jason and Claire huddled together on the couch, watching the rain streak down the windows in thin silver line. "Did you check the weather before booking this place?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with amusement and just a hint of nervousness. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "What, you don't like being stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell service during a storm?" Claire gave him a playful glare. "Oh, it's my dream vacation, obviously. Nothing like the fear of getting swept away by the ocean to really relax the nerves." Jason grinned, wrapping an arm around her. "Look at it this way. At least we've got a great view." Claire glanced toward the window, where the waves were crashing violently against the rocks below. "If we can still see it through the rain," she muttered. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sound of the storm outside. The wind howled, rattling the shutters, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the room. It was peaceful, in a strange, wild way. But then Claire noticed something strange. "Hey," she said, sitting up a little straighter. "Did you see that?" Jason frowned, following her gaze. "See what?" "That." Claire pointed out the window toward the ocean. "The lighthouse." Flickered. Jason squinted through the rain. "The lighthouse? I thought it was abandoned." "It is," Claire said, her brow furrowing, "but I swear I saw the light, just for a second." They both stared at the lighthouse in the distance, an old, crumbling structure that sat on the edge of the cliffs, It had been out of service for years, forgotten and left to rot with the passage of time. The locals told stories about it, legends of a keeper who had never left, even after the lighthouse was decommissioned. Jason had brushed them off as just that, stories. But now, in the middle of a storm, the thought of a flickering light sent a shiver down his spine. Lightning flashed again, and for just a split second, Jason saw it too, the faint glow of the lighthouse beacon, barely visible through the sheets of rain. "That's weird," Jason muttered. "Could be an electrical issue. Maybe it's not as abandoned as we thought. Or maybe the ghost stories were true," Claire said with a nervous laugh. Jason rolled his eyes. "Come on, Claire. There's no such thing as—" Another flash of lightning. This time, the light in the lighthouse wasn't faint. It blazed to life, casting a bright beam across the water. "Okay, that's definitely not supposed to happen," Jason said, standing up from the couch. "Let's check it out." "Are you serious?" Claire asked, staring at him like he'd just suggested swimming out to sea. "It's pouring out there." "We've got raincoats," Jason said, already grabbing his jacket. "Come on, it'll be an adventure." Claire groaned, but reluctantly pulled on her jacket as well. "Fine, but if we get struck by lightning, it's on you." They stepped outside, the rain immediately drenching them despite their coats. The wind whipped across the cliffs, pulling at their clothes as they made their way toward the lighthouse. The path was steep and slippery, the rocks wet and dangerous, but Jason was determined to get a closer look. As they approached the lighthouse, the beam of light swept across them, momentarily blinding them. Jason shielded his eyes, squinting up at the structure. The light was definitely on, glowing brightly from the top of the tower. "Maybe there's someone inside," Claire said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jason nodded, though the thought didn't make much sense. Who would be maintaining a lighthouse that had been abandoned for decades? And why tonight, during the worst storm of the year? They reached the base of the lighthouse, the door hanging slightly ajar. Jason exchanged a glance with Claire before pushing it open. The heavy wooden door creaked, revealing the narrow spiral staircase leading up to the tower. "I don't like this," Claire whispered, stepping inside reluctantly. "Something feels off." "Probably just the wind," Jason said, though he wasn't so sure himself. The air inside the lighthouse felt colder than it should have, and there was a strange, oppressive stillness that didn't sit right. They began to climb the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The higher they went, the louder the storm seemed to grow, as if the wind was pushing its way inside the very walls of the lighthouse. Halfway up, Claire stopped suddenly. "Jason, do you hear that?" Jason paused, listening intently. First, all he could hear was the howling wind and the creak of the old stairs. But then, faintly, beneath the noise of the storm, there was something else. A voice. It was soft, barely audible, like someone whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. Jason swallowed hard. "Maybe it's the wind," he said, though he didn't believe it. They continued up the stairs, the whispers growing louder with every step. By the time they reached the top, the voice was clear enough to make out the words. "You shouldn't be here." Jason and Claire froze. The room at the top of the lighthouse was empty, save for the large, rotating light that shone out over the ocean. There was no one there, and yet the voice had come from right behind them. "I think we should leave," Claire whispered, her face pale. Jason nodded. Before they could move, the light flickered and went out. They stood in total darkness, the wind screaming outside, the only sound now the frantic pounding of their hearts. Then slowly, a figure began to take shape in the shadows. A man, dressed in the old uniform of a lighthouse keeper, stood by the light, his face hidden in the gloom. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, his voice low and cold. Jason took a step back, pulling Claire with him. We're sorry. We didn't mean to trespass." The figure didn't move. "This lighthouse is mine," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "It always has been. It always will be." Claire's hand tightened on Jason's arm. "Jason, let's go." The figure took a step forward, his face still hidden in shadow. "You should have stayed away." Jason didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Claire's hand and bolted down the stairs, their footsteps echoing wildly as they fled. The lighthouse creaked and groaned as if it were alive, the whispers following them all the way down. They burst out into the storm, the wind and rain hitting them like a wall, but neither of them cared. They ran back to the cabin as fast as they could, not stopping until they were inside, slamming the door behind them. For a long moment, they stood there, gasping for breath, dripping wet, hearts racing. Finally, Claire spoke. What was that?" Jason shook his head, staring out the window at the lighthouse, now dark and looming on the cliffs. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I don't think we'll ever know."
Phantom train. Jake sat on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, trying to find something interesting to watch. The storm outside had intensified, and every now and then the power would flicker, making him glance nervously at the lights. "Great," he muttered to himself, tossing the remote aside. Couldn't they have picked a better night to go out? Thunder rumbled in the distance, followed by a flash of lightning that briefly lit up the darkened room. Jake shivered. Storms usually didn't bother him, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air that made his skin crawl. He was about to give up on the TV when he heard it. A long, low whistle. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But then he heard it again, louder this time and more distinct. Jake frowned and stood up, walking over to the window. He peered outside. All he could see was the rain pounding against the glass and the faint outline of the trees swaying in the wind. "Did that sound like a train?" he whispered to himself, brow furrowing. Didn't make any sense. There were no train tracks anywhere near his house. The nearest set of tracks was miles away, and he'd never heard of a train from there before. The whistle came again, closer now, followed by the faint sound of metal wheels grinding against iron tracks. Jake's heart started to race. There was no way a train could be anywhere near here, right? He pulled open the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The wind hit him immediately, and the rain soaked him within seconds. But he didn't care. He needed to know where that sound was coming from. The whistle sounded again, much louder now. It seemed to be coming from just down the road, beyond the trees. There were no tracks there, just fields and woods. Jake's stomach churned. He knew he shouldn't investigate. Every part of his brain was screaming at him to go back inside and wait for his parents. But his curiosity got the better of it. Grabbing his raincoat and flashlight, he stepped off the porch and started walking toward the sound. Further he went, the louder the whistle became. It echoed through the night, almost like it was calling out to him, beckoning him closer. As he walked, the rain began to ease, but the wind was still strong, whipping through the trees and making them groan. Jake kept his flashlight trained ahead, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, the sound of wheels grinding against tracks filled the air, louder than ever. Jake stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the distance through the trees, he could see the faint outline of a train. It was massive, an old-fashioned steam engine, its smokestack belching out thick black smoke that disappeared into the stormy sky. The train's windows glowed with a pale, eerie light, and as it rolled slowly toward him, the whistle sounded again, long and mournful. Jake blinked, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. There were no tracks here, no trains, and yet, here it was, creeping closer and closer. He took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The train's wheels screeched as it came to a halt just ahead of him, its whistle letting out one final piercing note that sent a shiver down his spine. Jake stared at the train, unable to move. The rain dripped from his hair, soaking into his clothes, but he barely noticed. All he could focus on was the eerie, ghostly train that had appeared out of nowhere. Then, with a hiss of steam, one of the doors slid open. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see inside. It was pitch black beyond the door. But he could feel something, a presence, something cold and dark. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, swirling around him, and Jake stumbled back, his heart racing. He turned to run, but before he could take more than a few steps, he heard a voice, a soft, raspy whisper that sent chills down his spine. "Wait," Jake froze, his feet rooted to the ground. "Wait." The voice was coming from the open door of the train. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make every hair on Jake's body stand on end. Slowly, against every instinct, he turned back toward the train. The door was still open, and now he could see a figure standing in the shadows, tall, gaunt, with long, bony fingers gripping the doorframe. Jake's mouth went dry. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, and the pale light from the train's windows illuminated its face. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was pale and gaunt, stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes were sunken deep into his face, black and hollow. He wore an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, the kind you'd see in photos from a century ago. The man smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, cold, and filled with malice. "Come aboard," the man rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Jake shook his head, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. "No," he stammered. "I'm not." "Come aboard," the man repeated, his voice low and insistent. "Train is waiting." Jake took a step back, his hands trembling. I don't want to." The man's smile widened, revealing yellow, jagged teeth. "You don't have a choice." Suddenly, the ground beneath Jake's feet shifted. He looked down and gasped. Tracks, iron train tracks, had appeared beneath him, running from the train all the way back toward his house. The air grew colder, and the wind howled louder. The train whistle let out another mournful wail, and the man in the doorway reached out toward Jake with one long, bony hand. Jake turned and ran. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. Could hear the sound of the train behind him, its wheels grinding against the tracks, chasing after him. His heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted through the rain, his feet slipping on the wet ground. The wind whipped around him, pulling at his clothes. He kept running, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The train whistle blared again, closer now, and Jake could feel the presence of the man behind him, reaching out with those cold, bony fingers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake burst through the front door of his house, slamming it shut behind him. He collapsed onto the floor, his chest heaving, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. For a long moment, he lay there, listening to the sound of the wind and the rain outside. The whistle had stopped, and the grinding sound of the train's wheels was gone. Slowly, shakily, Jake stood up and peered out the window. The train was gone. Tracks were gone. It was as if they had never been there at all. Jake's heart still raced, but he felt a wave of relief wash over him. He was safe. Train, the man, they were gone. But just as he turned away from the window, he heard it. Faint sound of a train whistle, far off in the distance. And this time, it didn't sound like it was leaving. It sounded like it was coming back.
The storm shelter secret. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the ground with a force that made it sound like the sky was splitting open. Thunder cracked overhead, and the wind rattled the trees until they bent almost sideways. Inside their small farmhouse, Mark rushed his family down the stairs to the storm shelter, slamming the heavy door shut behind them just as the worst of the storm hit. "Everyone okay?" Mark asked, slightly out of breath. Lisa nodded, holding Emma close to her side, while Jake, their teenage son, sat on the small bench against the wall, looking annoyed. "Another storm?" Jake groaned, rolling his eyes. "It's like the third one this week." "Better safe than sorry," Lisa said, gently patting Emma's back. "These storms have been getting worse." Mark clicked on the battery-powered lantern in the corner, casting a warm glow over the small concrete room. It wasn't fancy, just a few shelves stocked with canned food, water, and blankets, but it was sturdy, and that was all that mattered when the weather got bad. Outside, the wind howled louder, shaking the storm shelter door as if trying to rip it open. The noise was unnerving, but the family had been through plenty of storms before. "It'll pass soon," Mark said, trying to keep his voice light, though the storm's fury made him uneasy. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the wind scream and the thunder boom overhead. The storm raged on, each crack of lightning sounding closer and closer. Suddenly, amidst the thunder and the wind, there was another sound, a knock. At first Mark thought he'd imagined it, but then it came again, a slow, deliberate knock on the storm shelter door. Knock, knock. Lisa's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Mark nodded, his brow furrowing. "It's probably just debris hitting the door. The wind's strong enough to send branches flying." But the knocks came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Jake sat up straight, his expression shifting from boredom to concern. "Dad, who's knocking? There's no one else out there, right?" Mark stood up slowly, his eyes locked on the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs. No one should be out there. Everyone knows to stay indoors during a storm like this. The knocking came again, more urgent now. Knock, knock, knock. Emma clung to her mother's arm, voice trembling. What if it's someone who needs help? Mark hesitated. The storm was bad, really bad. No one should be outside in this weather. But if someone was out there, knocking, could they really ignore it? I'll take a look, Mark said, grabbing the flashlight and heading toward the door. Mark, be careful, Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with worry. Mark nodded and climbed the stairs. The knocks had stopped, replaced by the relentless sound of rain pounding against the metal door. He pressed his ear against the door, listening. Nothing. He slowly unlatched the door and pushed it open just a crack, peering out into the rain-soaked yard. The storm was wild. Trees whipped back and forth, the sky lit up with flashes of lightning, but there was no one there. Hello? Mark called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. Is anyone out there? Nothing, just the howling wind and pouring rain. Mark frowned, his stomach twisting with unease. He shut the door again, locking it behind him as he made his way back down the stairs. There's no one out there, he said, voice tight. Then who was knocking? Jake asked, his eyes wide. Mark didn't have an answer. They sat in silence for a while, the storm continuing to batter the house above them. Everyone was on edge, listening for any other strange sounds. Then, after what felt like hours, the knocking returned. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. It's back, Emma whispered, her face pale. Maybe it's someone who needs help, Lisa said, her voice shaking. Maybe they were too far away before. But Mark shook his head. I checked, Lisa. There's no one out there. The knocking continued, growing more frantic. Knock, knock, knock. Jake stood up, pacing nervously. Dad, this is weird. What if it's not a person? Mark shot him a look. Don't start with that. I'm serious, Jake said, his voice rising. What if it's something else, something trying to get in? Jake, stop it, Lisa said sharply. You're scaring Emma. But even Lisa couldn't hide the fear in her voice. The knocking was louder now, echoing through the small shelter. It didn't sound like a person anymore. It sounded wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. Mark stood, grabbing the flashlight again. I'll check one more time. Climbed the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The knocking continued, relentless. Knock, knock, knock. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. Something about the knocking felt off. Like whatever was on the other side wasn't knocking to get in, but knocking to scare them. Taking a deep breath, he yanked the door open. Rain poured in, drenching him instantly. He shone the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam across the yard. Nothing. Just as he was about to shut the door, lightning flashed, illuminating something in the distance. Mark froze. There, just at the edge of the property, stood a figure. Belle. Shadowy. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but its eyes were glowing. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He slammed the door shut, bolting it quickly. What did you see? Lisa asked, her voice trembling as Mark descended the stairs. Nothing, Mark said quickly. Too quickly. It's just the storm. Let's just wait it out. They all sat in tense silence as the storm raged on. The knocking stopped, but the unsettling feeling lingered, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the storm began to pass. The rain lessened, and the wind died down. The house above them creaked and groaned, but all was quiet. Is it over? Jake asked, his voice hopeful. I think so, Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. Cautiously, they opened the storm shelter door and emerged into the daylight. The yard was a mess, branches strewn everywhere, the ground soaked and muddy, but the storm had passed. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but then Emma gasped, pointing at the storm shelter door. Look, Mark turned, his stomach dropping. There, etched into the metal of the storm shelter door, were deep claw marks. Long, jagged scratches that hadn't been there before. He stared in silence, the reality sinking in. Whatever had been knocking, it hadn't been human. The storm's echo. The storm was coming again. In the old farmhouse, the family had learned to expect it. Every time the clouds gathered and the wind picked up, strange things would happen. It started small, just creaks and groans from the old wooden beams, but it always got worse when the rain began to fall. The farmhouse had been in the family for generations, passed down like an old secret, walls thick with stories. But this story, the one about the knocking, was never spoken out loud. Not until tonight. The family huddled inside as the rain poured down harder, trying to focus on the flickering TV. The storm raged outside, lightning lighting up the sky every few seconds. It felt as if the storm was right above them, like the house was being swallowed by the dark clouds. Then came the first knock. 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 At first it was so faint that they barely noticed it. It sounded like it came from inside the walls. But with the wind howling outside, it could have been anything. Or so they told themselves. "Did you hear that?" one asked, looking up from their phone. "Yeah, probably just the storm," another replied, though their voice didn't sound so sure. They tried to return to their distractions, ignoring the growing unease in the room. But then it happened again. Knock, knock. This time it was louder and clearer, coming from inside the walls. Everyone froze. "Okay, that wasn't just me, right?" Teenage daughter asked, eyes wide. "Nope," Dad said, standing up slowly. "That was definitely inside." Mom glanced nervously at the ceiling. "It's an old house, you know. Could be the pipes." "Pipes don't knock like that," the younger son muttered, his eyes darting toward the wall. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Knock, knock. It echoed through the living room, as if something or someone was trying to get their attention. Dad, always the one to fix things, grabbed a flashlight and marched toward the wall. "I'll check it out," he said, though the slight tremble in his voice gave him away. He tapped the wall with the flashlight. "Anyone home?" Silent. Everyone waited, listening, holding their breath. Knock, knock. It was closer now, right behind the wall. Dad stepped back, his eyes wide. "That's not normal," he muttered. Daughter, ever the brave one, moved closer to the wall. "Do you think it's a ghost?" she asked, half joking but also half serious. "I don't believe in ghosts," Dad replied quickly, though his hands were shaking. "Maybe it's just a mouse?" the son offered, though he didn't sound convinced. But deep down, they all knew. It wasn't a mouse. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't the wind. Something was inside the walls. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Power surged and the TV went dark, plunging the room into shadows. The only light now came from the occasional flash of lightning outside. "Great, just what we needed," Mom said, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Power outage." But the knocking didn't stop. Knock, knock. And then, as if the storm itself was speaking, they heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost too quiet to hear. "Help me." The family froze. "What was that?" the son asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Dad said, backing away from the wall. "I don't know." The whisper came again, louder this time, though the words were still muffled. "Help me." "It's coming from inside the walls," the daughter said, her face pale. "There's someone in there." "That's impossible," Mom snapped, though her voice shook with fear. "No one could be in the walls." "Maybe." Dad hesitated. "Maybe there's something we don't know about this house." "You mean like secret room or something?" the son asked, his eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. Before anyone could respond, the whisper came again, more desperate now. "Help me, please. Let me out." Dad moved back toward the wall, this time with purpose. Pressed his ear against the wood, listening intently. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, knock, knock. He jumped back, startled. "There's something in there," he muttered, rubbing his forehead. "But how? We've lived here for years. We would have found it by now." The daughter grabbed a nearby chair, standing on it to inspect the wall closer. "There has to be something we're missing," she said, running her hands along the surface. "Old houses like this have secrets, right?" She knocked lightly on the wood. Thud, thud. It was hollow. "Found it," she announced, her heart racing. "There's a space behind here." Dad grabbed the hammer from the toolbox, his hands shaking as he pried at the edges of the wall. The wood splintered easily, crumbling away like it had been waiting for this moment. Behind the wall was a small, hidden door, a door that had been sealed shut for years. "What is this?" Mom asked, staring in disbelief. "How did we never notice this before?" "I don't know," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I think it's time we find out." He pulled at the edges of the door, and with a groan, it creaked open. The space behind it was dark, cold, and from that darkness, the whisper came again, clearer now. "Help me. Let me out." And then they saw him. "Found it," she announced, her heart racing. "There's a space behind here." Dad grabbed the hammer from the toolbox, his hands shaking as he pried at the edges of the wall. The wood splintered easily, crumbling away like it had been waiting for this moment. Behind the wall was a small, hidden door, a door that had been sealed shut for years. "What is this?" Mom asked, staring in disbelief. How did we never notice this before? I don't know, Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper, but I think it's time we find out. He pulled at the edges of the door, and with a groan, it creaked open. The space behind it was dark, cold, and from that darkness, the whisper came again, clearer now. Help me. Let me out. And then they saw him. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a warning, the rain lashing against the windows as if it, too, wanted to escape the impending terror. Set you free? Dad repeated, stepping back from the door. His voice trembled now, his bravado slipping away. How? What do you mean? The figure's hollow eyes locked onto his, unblinking, as though peering straight into his soul. I was buried here, the figure whispered, his voice soft but chilling. I sought refuge from a storm like this long ago, but the family that lived here, they didn't want me to leave, so they sealed me inside the walls. Live. The family stood in stunned silence, the weight of the words sinking in. They thought I was dangerous, figure continued, his voice fading in and out with the wind. But I wasn't. I just needed shelter. I didn't mean any harm. But why now? The daughter asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Why, after all these years? What do you want from us? The figure's expression twisted into one of sorrow, the pale outline of his face trembling. Because no one has listened before. Storms, they bring me back. I can only reach out when the weather is violent like that night. And this is the strongest storm in decades. His voice wavered, as if he were losing strength. You must let me out. I've been trapped for so long. Dad looked back at the others, fear and uncertainty written across their faces. How do we let you out? He asked, though every fiber of his being wanted to run far, far away. Figure raised a hand, pointing to the wall that had hidden the door for so long. Break it. Break the foundation, and I can be free. Wait, Mom said quickly, stepping forward. What if this is a trick? What if he's not what he says he is? We don't know what will happen if we let him out. The son, his voice small, added, what if he's dangerous? Figure's eyes flickered with a strange light, and for a moment the air seemed to grow colder. I'm not dangerous, he whispered, his voice soft but bam. I'm just tired of being alone, trapped in the dark. But what if? Mom began, but the figure's hollow, I don't want to hurt you. The figure whispered, his tone urgent now. I just want to rest, to be free of this house, of this storm. Family stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The storm outside was growing fiercer by the minute, the lightning flashing closer, the thunder shaking the walls. The knocking had stopped, but now the whispers filled the air, surrounding them. Please, let me go. Figure pleaded, his eyes locked onto the daughter's. You're my only chance. The daughter hesitated, looking back at her family and then at the figure trapped in the wall. Something about his voice pulled at her heart. Sadness in his eyes felt real. Desperate. Could they really leave him there, trapped for eternity? Dad, sensing her hesitation, spoke softly. We don't know what he is, honey. We don't know what'll happen if we break that wall. But what if it's true? She asked, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. What if he's been trapped all this time, and we're his only hope? The storm raged louder, as if urging them to make a decision. The figure's voice cut through the noise once more. Please, and so long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dad made a decision. He picked up the hammer again, his grip shaky. I'll do it, he said quietly, looking at the wall. I'll break the foundation, but if anything goes wrong, we run. Mom grabbed his arm. Are you sure? What if? I don't know, Dad admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. But we can't just leave him here. If it were us, we'd want someone to help, right? The daughter nodded, stepping aside to give Dad room. The son stood back, still nervous, watching closely. With a deep breath, Dad raised the hammer and swung it at the base of the wall. The wood splintered easily, chunks of plaster falling away with each strike. Dust filled the air, mixing with the dampness of the storm. The moment the hammer struck the foundation itself, the house seemed to shudder. A deep, groaning sound echoed from within the walls, as though the very structure of the farmhouse was reacting. Keep going, the daughter urged, though her voice trembled. Dad struck again and again, each hit loosening the foundation a little more. Figure inside the wall seemed to flicker, his form growing more defined with each swing. Finally, with one last blow, the foundation cracked. A low, eerie sound filled the room. A sound that wasn't the storm or the wind, but something older. Something from deep within the house itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, figure vanished. Family stood in stunned silence, staring at the empty space where the pale face had been. Did we do it? Son asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the storm outside seemed to ease. The wind slowed, the rain softened, and the lightning moved further into the distance. The violent energy that had gripped the farmhouse, all night was gone, leaving behind a strange, eerie calm. Dad dropped the hammer, his hands shaking. I think it's over. The daughter stepped forward, peering into the broken foundation. He's gone. You think he's free now? I don't know, Mom said quietly, wrapping her arms around her daughter. But I hope so. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft patter of rain against the windows, the last remnants of the storm fading away. Finally, Dad let out a deep breath. Let's get out of here. We'll deal with the wall tomorrow. The family slowly made their way to the door, glancing back at the broken wall one last time before stepping out into the cool, damp night. The air outside felt fresher, lighter, as if the storm had washed away more than just the rain. As they drove away from the farmhouse, the daughter couldn't help but glance back, watching as the old house disappeared into the distance. For the first time in years, it looked peaceful.
The weeping tree. It had been raining for hours. A kind of steady, relentless rain that made you want to curl up under a blanket and never leave. The wind howled outside, tugging at the shutters, but inside, everything felt safe and cozy. At least that's what it should have felt like. Emma sat curled up on the couch, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. Her younger brother, Max, was sprawled out beside her, half asleep, a book resting on his chest. Their parents were upstairs, tucked away in their bedroom, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. Something about the storm tonight felt different. Emma couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an odd feeling in the air, like the wind was carrying whispers and the rain was trying to say something. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the house. Max jolted awake, blinking in confusion. What was that? He muttered, rubbing his eyes. Emma sat up, her heart racing. The knock had come from outside, but it didn't sound like someone knocking on the door. It was more like something hitting the walls. Did you hear that? Max asked, sitting up now, fully alert. Emma nodded slowly, her eyes shifting to the window. The rain was falling harder now, almost like it was angry. Came from outside, she whispered. Max groaned. Probably just a branch hitting the house. It's super windy out there. Emma wasn't so sure. The sound hadn't been random, it had been steady, like someone or something was knocking. Then it came again, a low, muffled thud, followed by what sounded like crying. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max frowned. Hear what? That crying, Emma said, standing up slowly and moving toward the window. She peered outside, but all she could see was the rain-drenched yard and the outline of the trees swaying in the wind. Max joined her at the window, squinting into the darkness. I don't hear any crying, he said, but his voice was uneasy. Emma pressed her ear closer to the glass. Crying was faint, but it was definitely there. It sounded like a woman sobbing, her voice filled with pain and sorrow. Come on, Emma said suddenly, grabbing her raincoat from the chair. Let's go check outside. Max's eyes widened. Are you crazy? It's pouring out there. I know, Emma said, already pulling on her coat. But what if someone's out there? What if they need help? Max hesitated, clearly torn between staying dry and being the responsible older brother. Finally, he groaned and grabbed his coat. Fine, but if I catch a cold, I'm blaming you. They stepped outside into the storm, the rain immediately drenching them despite their coats. The wind howled through the trees, and the ground was already turning to mud beneath their feet. Emma led the way, her heart racing as they made their way toward the sound. The crying was louder now, unmistakable, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere near the large, gnarled tree that stood at the edge of their yard. The tree had been there for as long as they could remember. It was ancient, thick branches twisting like the arms of an old tired giant. Their parents always said the tree was special, though they'd never explained why, just that it had been part of the property for generations. Now, as they approached, Emma could see something strange. The tree? It almost looked like it was weeping. Max stopped in his tracks. Emma? Am I seeing things? Or is that tree crying? Emma's breath caught in her throat. He was right. There along the bark were thin, red streaks, almost like tears of blood, trickling down from the tree's trunk. What is that? Max whispered, taking a step back. Emma didn't answer. She moved closer, her eyes wide with horror and fascination. The red tears weren't water and they weren't sap. They looked like real blood, running down the bark in thin, glistening lines. Crying was louder now, almost deafening, and it was definitely coming from the tree. Emma swallowed hard, her voice barely audible over the storm. We need to tell Mom and Dad. Max nodded quickly. Yeah, let's get out of here. They turned to run back to the house, but just as they started to move, the wind shifted, and a loud creaking sound filled the air. Emma whipped around just in time to see one of the tree's branches bending toward them. It wasn't swaying with the wind. It was moving on its own. Run, she shouted, grabbing Max's arm and pulling him away just as the branch crashed down where they had been standing moments before. They sprinted back to the house, their hearts pounding, and slammed the door behind them. Inside, they stood dripping wet, panting, and staring at each other with wide eyes. What was that? Max asked, his voice shaking. Emma shook her head. I don't know, but something is wrong with that tree. They hurried upstairs to their parents' room, banging on the door. Mom, Dad, Emma shouted, grabbing Max's arm and pulling him away just as the branch crashed down where they had been standing moments before. They sprinted back to the house, their hearts pounding, and slammed the door behind them. Inside, they stood dripping wet, panting, and staring at each other with wide eyes. What was that? Max asked, his voice shaking. Emma shook her head. I don't know, but something is wrong with that tree. They hurried upstairs to their parents' room, banging on the door. Mom, Dad, Emma shouted, her voice frantic. Their mom opened the door, looking confused and groggy. What's going on? Why are you two soaked? It's the tree, Max blurted out. The big one outside. It's crying and bleeding. Their dad appeared behind their mom, frowning. What are you talking about? Trees don't cry. I know, Emma said, her words rushing out in a panic. But this one is. We heard it, and then the branch, it moved like it was trying to grab us. Their mom exchanged a worried glance with their dad. You two need to calm down, she said. It's late, and the storm is probably making everything seem worse than it is. We're not imagining it, Emma insisted. Come outside and see for yourselves. Their dad sighed but grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand. Fine, let's go take a look. The four of them made their way back outside, the rain still falling in heavy sheets. Their dad aimed the flashlight at the tree, its beam cutting through the darkness. But now, the tree looked perfectly normal. No blood, no crying, just a silent, old tree standing in the storm like it had for years. Max's jaw dropped. No way, it was right there. I swear, Emma said, her voice trembling. It was real. Their parents exchanged a glance, clearly skeptical but not wanting to dismiss them completely. Let's head back inside, their dad said. It's late, and this storm isn't letting up. Defeated, Emma and Max followed their parents back inside, the strange events of the night still fresh in their minds. But just as they were about to head to bed, the sound of sobbing echoed through the house again. Their mom froze. Did you hear that? Emma's heart raced. It's the tree. They all ran to the window, and there it was again. The tree stood in the yard, weeping blood, and the faint sound of crying drifted toward them on the wind. Suddenly, their dad's face went pale. I remember now. What? Emma asked, her voice shaking. The tree, their dad said, his voice hollow. The locals always talked about it. They said it was planted over the grave of a woman who was wrongfully hanged years ago. They say she cries during storms for her lost life. Emma and Max stared at their dad in horror. Why didn't you ever tell us? Max asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't think it was real, their dad said, his eyes still fixed on the weeping tree. I thought it was just a story. But now, as the storm raged outside and the cries grew louder, it was clear that the story was very, very real.
Voices in the wind. The wind had been restless all day. It whispered through the trees, brushed against the windows, and carried with it the heavy promise of a storm. Lila sat on her bed, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She always loved storms. They made her feel alive, like the world was waking up in a way it usually didn't. But tonight, the wind felt different. Lila had always been sensitive to things like that. She could feel when something was wrong, even if she couldn't explain why. And as the wind picked up, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell her something. Parents were downstairs, busy with their usual evening routine. The sound of the TV floated up the stairs, but it felt distant, muffled by the growing storm. Lila turned away from the window, trying to focus on her homework, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave her. The wind outside seemed to be growing louder, and every now and then it almost sounded like, no, that was ridiculous. She shook her head, trying to laugh off the thought. There was no way the wind was speaking. It was just her imagination, right? But as the first raindrops splattered against the glass, Lila heard it again. Faint voice carried on the wind. It was soft, barely there, but unmistakable. Lila. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood up slowly, her eyes wide as she moved closer to the window. The wind howled louder, and the voice came again, clearer this time. Layla, help. Lila's stomach twisted in knots. She pressed her hands against the cold glass, staring out into the yard. The trees swayed wildly, their branches scratching against the sides of the house. The rain was falling harder now, turning the world into a blur of gray and green. But there was no one outside, no one who could be calling her name. She backed away from the window, her pulse racing. This isn't real, she whispered to herself. It's just the wind. It's just a storm. But then she heard it again. Lila, help us. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't imagining it. The wind was talking to her. She could hear the voices, soft and pleading, almost drowned out by the sound of the storm. She rushed downstairs, her heart thudding in her chest. Her parents were in the living room, completely oblivious to what was happening outside. Mom, Dad, Lila blurted out, her voice more frantic than she intended. Her parents looked up, startled. What's wrong, sweetie? Her mom asked, putting down the TV remote. Did you hear that? Lila asked, her voice shaking. Hear what? Her dad asked, frowning. The wind, it's talking. I know it sounds crazy, but it's saying my name, asking for help. Her mom raised an eyebrow, exchanging a concerned glance with her dad. Honey, it's just a storm, she said gently. Storms make all kinds of weird noises. You're probably just hearing things. I'm not, Lila insisted. I swear I heard voices. They were saying my name. They were asking for help. Her dad sighed, giving her a reassuring smile. Look, storms can be spooky, especially when it's windy like this. But I promise, there's no one outside. Just the wind. Lila's heart sank. They didn't believe her. She didn't blame them. It sounded ridiculous. She knew what she'd heard. I'm going outside, Lila said suddenly, grabbing her raincoat from the hook by the door. Her mom stood up quickly. Lila, no, you can't go out in this weather. It's dangerous. I just need to check, Lila said, pulling on her coat. I have to know if it's real. Her dad moved toward her, shaking his head. Lila, this storm is bad. Can't go outside. But Lila had already made up her mind. Before they could stop her, she opened the door and ran out into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall, pushing against her with a force that nearly knocked her off her feet. Rain lashed at her face, soaking her within seconds, but she didn't care. She had to know. Lila, the voice came again, louder now, carried on the fierce gusts of wind. It was coming from the woods at the edge of the yard. She stumbled toward the trees, her heart pounding in her chest. The wind was screaming now, tugging at her clothes, trying to pull her back, but she kept moving forward. Trees loomed above her, their branches twisting and swaying in the storm. The rain made it hard to see, but she could hear the voice, clearer, more urgent. Lila, please, help us. She pushed through the branches, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind roared in her ears, but she could hear the voices now, multiple voices, all whispering her name. Lila. And then suddenly, she saw it. Figure. Standing in the center of the clearing, drenched by the rain. It was a woman, pale, with long dark hair plastered against her face. Clothes were tattered, and she looked like she'd been there for years. But it wasn't just her. There were more. Shadows, all around her, barely visible in the rain, but there. Watching. Lila's heart stopped. Boo, who are you? she whispered, her voice trembling. The woman's eyes met hers. They were wide and filled with sorrow. "We're trapped," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "We've been here for so long. We need your help." Lila took a step back, her mind racing. "Trapped? Where?" The woman lifted a trembling hand, pointing toward the ground. "Underneath," she whispered. "We're buried here. The wind, it's the only way we can speak." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "Buried? But how?" The woman shook her head, her voice growing fainter. "There was a storm long ago. The trees fell. The earth swallowed us. No one ever came for us. We've been waiting so long." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want me to do?" "Tell someone," the woman whispered, her voice fading with the wind. "Please let them know we're here." And then, just like that, figures began to dissolve. The rain washed them away, and the wind grew quieter, the voices fading into the storm. Lila stood there, trembling, her mind spinning. She didn't know if what she had seen was real, or if it was just some strange vision brought on by the storm. But she knew one thing for sure. The wind had spoken to her. And now, she had to listen.